November 3rd of 1918, Austria-Hungary surrendered to the Allies. That same day, German sailors mutinied against government authority. The mutiny spread quickly. Everywhere in Germany, groups of soldiers and workers organized revolutionary councils. On November 9th, socialist leaders in capital Berlin established the German Republic, and the Kaiser gave up the throne. Although there were no Allied soldiers on German territory and no truly decisive battle had been fought, the Germans were just too exhausted to continue fighting. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day in the 11th month of 1918, Germany agreed to a ceasefire and signed an armistice. World War I was the bloodiest war in history up to that time. Deaths numbered about 22 million, more than half of them civilians, 20 million people wounded, 10 million became refugees. And across the Atlantic, Americans are rejoicing at the news. Many now expect life to return to normal, but Woodrow Wilson has other things in his sights first. So Wilson, on January of 1918, at a magnificent palace of Versailles outside of Paris, tried to persuade the Allies to construct a just and lasting peace and to establish a League of Nations.
Wilson wanted the war to end, but when announcing his 14 points in January of 1918, Wilson didn't just want to end the war to protect America, he hoped to prevent wars from ever happening again. So together with his advisor and friend, Colonel Edward M. House, President Wilson organized a group of 150 political and social scientists to study Allied and American policy all over the globe, collecting nearly 2,000 reports and 1,200 maps. This would inform the idealistic 14 points, which would address causes of the World War and also propose solutions to ensure world peace in the future through policy and negotiations. 8 of the 14 points were aimed at resolving specific territorial issues among the countries involved in combat, and securing borders and statehood for Italy, the Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary. 5 points covered general principles for a peaceful world: open treaties and agreements, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims to land. These were all based on the principles of self-determination, the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves without interference from other countries. The 14th and most influential point proposed that countries form an alliance to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. The 14-point speech reflected a tradition of diplomatic idealism that would come to define Wilson's presidency. But how did that idealism translate into action? Well, most of Wilson's points were never fully realized, but one point in particular would have a big impact on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I.
Okay guys, I'm going to go kind of fast because the 14 points are something that you have heard about before. Even before the war was over, Wilson presented his plan for world peace. On January 18th of 1918, he delivered his now famous 14-point speech to Congress. The points were divided into groups, just like the video just suggested. The first 5 points were issues that Wilson believed had to be addressed to prevent another war, like there should be no secret treaties among nations, there should be freedom of the seas, free trade, reduced armaments, and colonial adjustments. The next 8 points dealt with boundary changes. Wilson based these provisions on the principle of self-determination, like the video just suggested, along historically established lines of nationality. In other words, groups that claim distinct ethnic identities were to form their own nation-states or decide for themselves to what nations that they would belong. You know as well as I do, though, that that is a difficult thing, because even though the film suggested that he had 1,200 different maps, how in the world would you represent every different ethnic group? I mean, just look at the United States and how diverse it is. The 14th point, of course, called for the League of Nations. This was a forum for nations to discuss and settle their grievances without having to resort to war. So very idealistic and important. So just a couple of points and counterpoints. This part will be new from last year's information. So first of all, I'm going to read a piece that is a proponent, is groups of people that were proposing the League of Nations. President Wilson campaigned for the League of Nations as necessary to meet the differing and unexpected contingencies that could threaten world peace. Wilson believed the League would create a forum where nations could talk through their disagreements. He hoped it would provide collective security. He thought it would bring respect. He thought it would prevent actually devastating war. On the other hand, we had a senator named William Borah, and he was joined by others who really were critical of this idea. He said that he objected to the U.S. membership in the League of Nations because he feared the membership would draw the United States away from isolationism and into the internal affairs of other countries. Many opponents also feared that the League would nullify other agreements that had already been put into place, like the Monroe Doctrine. So how does this work with other statements that have been made in the past by the United States and what territories that we are willing to defend? Wilson's naivete about the political aspects of securing a peace treaty showed itself in his failure to grasp the anger of the Allied leaders. So when he got there, he wasn't fully expecting what he got. Georges Clemenceau was considered kind of the realist at the group. Now, first of all, there were all kinds of people at the Treaty of Versailles. However, there was a kind of powerful group that emerged as kind of the inner circle, and those are the people we're going to talk about right here. So Georges Clemenceau is from France, and he is the kind of realism. He had lived through 2 German invasions of France, and he was really determined to just simply prevent future invasions of his country. David Lloyd George was the new British Prime Minister, and he wanted money back. He wanted to make Germany pay. The Italian Prime Minister was interested in territory. Now that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had fallen, the Ottoman Empire had fallen, and Italy was right there. Contrary to custom, the peace conference did not include the Central Powers, nor did it include Russia. And we've talked a lot before about how that is going to create some problems. Instead, the Big Four, Wilson, Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and Orlando, worked out, for the most part, the treaty's details among themselves. Wilson conceded a lot of his 14 points because he thought that the League of Nations was the most important aspect of this discussion. Okay, some quick things to know about the treaty. So the Treaty of Versailles established 9 new nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, amongst others, and shifted boundaries of other nations. It carved 5 areas out of the old Ottoman Empire and gave them to France and Great Britain as mandates. For example, Iraq and Syria were actually handed over to Britain and France, which is going to create some problems in the Middle East moving forward. Those 2 allies were to administer their respective mandates until the areas were ready for self-rule and independence, but as is often the case, they weren't necessarily provided that independence into the future. The treaty barred Germany from maintaining an army and also required Germany to pay war damages in the amount of $33 billion. The treaty's weaknesses included the treatment of Germany. It weakened its ability of the Treaty of Versailles to provide a lasting peace in Europe. Several basic flaws in the treaty sowed seeds of post-war international problems that would eventually, and very quickly actually, become the Second World War. First, the treaty was absolutely humiliating to Germany. It contained a war guilt clause forcing Germany to admit sole responsibility and playing a major role in igniting the war. Other European nations had been guilty of provoking diplomatic crises before the war as well, but they weren't held accountable by the treaty. Furthermore, there was no way Germany was going to be able to pay the huge financial reparations, so it's kind of like pushing somebody up against a wall and then, and critiquing them harshly. Of course, they're going to come out in a need to defend themselves. Germany was stripped of its colonial possessions in the Pacific, which might have helped it to be able to pay off some of its reparation bill. In addition, for 3 years, the Russians had fought on the sides of the Allies, suffering higher casualty rates than any other nation, but because Russia was excluded from the peace conference, it lost more territory than Germany did. As Russia was officially called after 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they became determined to regain that former lost territory. When Wilson returned to the United States, he faced really strong opposition to the treaty. Some people, including Herbert Hoover, believed it was way too harsh. Hoover noted the economic consequences alone will hold down all of Europe and thus injure the United States. Others considered the treaty a sellout to imperialism because it simply exchanged one set of colonial rules for another. Some ethnic groups objected to the treaty because the new national boundaries it established didn't satisfy their particular demands for self-determination, which is right where we started. And the main domestic opposition in the United States was centered on the issue of the League of Nations. A few opponents believed the League threatened the U.S. foreign policy of isolationism. Really conservative senators like Henry Cabot Lodge and the gentleman we'd already mentioned were really suspicious of the provision for joint economic and military action against aggression, even though it was voluntary. They wanted the constitutional right of Congress to declare war included in the treaty, and not that power delegated to anything else. So what about the legacy of the Treaty of Versailles?
When the Allies met in Versailles to create a treaty to end the war, they were less interested in Wilson's idealistic vision and more interested in regaining what they had lost and punishing Germany. To Wilson's disappointment, the points were barely integrated and only to the benefit of the Allies. Most of them weren't actually adopted or honored by anyone after the treaty was signed. However, the 14th point was incorporated: the creation of a world organization providing collective security. This would later be known as the League of Nations. Ironically, despite a campaign from Wilson, the U.S. never actually joined the League of Nations. Wilson foreshadowed that without American membership in the League, there would be another world war within a generation. Sure enough, World War II would break out just 20 years later.
When World War I ended, many Americans looked forward to a return of what Warren G. Harding called normalcy. However, both the United States and the rest of the world had been utterly transformed by the war. At home, World War I had strengthened both the United States military and the power of the government. It had also accelerated social change, especially for African Americans and women. In addition, the propaganda campaign had provoked powerful fears and antagonisms that were left unchanneled when the war finally came to an end. In Europe, the destruction and massive loss of life severely damaged social and political systems, and in many countries, the war created political instability and violence that persisted for decades. During the war years, the first communist states were established in Russia, while after the war, militant fascist organizations seized control in Italy and Spain and Germany. Appalled by the scale of destruction, Americans began to call World War I the war to end all wars, in the hope that humanity would never again be willing to fight such a war. However, unresolved issues in Europe would eventually drag America into an even wider war. The Treaty of Versailles had settled nothing, and in fact, some Europeans longed to resume the fight. The ominous shape of things to come emerged in the writings of an Austrian named Adolf Hitler, an angry veteran of World War I. It cannot be that 2 million Germans should have fallen in vain. No, we do not pardon. We demand vengeance, says Hitler. 2 decades after the end of the Great War, Adolf Hitler's desire for vengeance would plunge the world into an even greater war in which the United States would play a leading role. First World War casualties. And I think it's important to pay attention to casualty percentage on the far right as well.